I'm excited to be here, excited for Mark having organized all of this. A little bit about me. Let's see if I can make my slides. Yep. I'm Jen. I am one of the founders of a company called Range. We build team success software. So we work in the future of work. I've previously worked as a future of work consultant, which is not what we call ourselves because that sounds a little annoying. We talk about ourselves as organizational development or organizational design consultants. So I've worked with companies like Microsoft, kind of smaller tech companies, like kind of depending on the type of thing that they were looking for, often about how teams are working together. I'm also a big nerd in this space, so I just read a lot of the articles, and that informs a lot of what we do at Range. We actually think of ourselves as software builders, but also as people who are educating companies on how they can work differently. So I always go back to my sales team and I'm like, it's okay if we don't sell Range, but we want to change how this company is operating. We want to help them change how they're working together. And so that kind of informs a lot of the work that we do. And on the education side, I'm nowhere near as fluent as you all are, though I was a one-time teaching assistant at Princeton for a brief period, which is another talk in and of itself, and a long-time student, obviously, of both many types of education, but excited to be around folks in this space right now. And I think the future of work is kind of a funny topic. It's often in the news and it's talked about like this. I don't know if anyone else was a fan of Robotech when they were 12, but it's an anime that I was really into. And so when you see the headlines around the future of work, and apologies if any of this is duplicative from what was shared earlier, but it's often like robots are taking over, like no one will need to work or teach or do anything again. And you're like, really? Because it seems like humans are pretty involved in what we're doing today. And it's interesting from what I've seen and experienced is that the future of work is really much more focused on people and how we work together. I don't know if anyone has seen the book Ghost Work, about a lot of the people, that goes on behind AI and the people involved in that kind of seemingly technology only work. But a lot of what we see in the work that we've done with a lot of companies is they're focused on how technology can optimize things, but also how you optimize how people work together. And that's what I'm pretty excited about as an individual, and we at Range are, about how you help people realize their full potential. And I think, not to overstep, but I think that's also what education roughly focuses on, is how do we help people realize their potential, and thinking about people through that potential growth mindset lens versus like they're kind of born that way. And so what I'm really excited to kind of share today is how learnings from the future of work can actually impact your day-to-day. And one of the lenses that I have on this is, and I'm not an educator, so apologies if I misspeak, but my sense is that a lot of the conversation is how you improve the work and the environment for students. And so a little bit of what I want to focus on is how you improve the environment for teachers and educators and people working in the space. Because my lens on this is that how you work determines what you can achieve, which in this case is what you can do with students and what you're able to create that environment. And I think when you walk into a tech company, first off, you're at a Google or Facebook and you're like, wow, they have a lot of money. This is really fancy. Of course, they can do all these amazing things. Like, they must throw so much money at this. And thank you all. But what I think you'll also notice, like, you'll see the open workspaces, people coming in and out of conferences, all these chaotic interactions that are happening. And what's powerful there is the way in which they're actually working. And so I want to talk through kind of some of the key learnings that we've seen in our work, but we have a small group, so hopefully this is more of a conversation. I'm not fussed. Happy to pause and we can kind of talk through some of these different topics, because obviously I have knowledge on what companies are doing, but despite interviewing a few friends over coffee and beers, I don't have as much knowledge about what education is doing and how you're thinking about this space. So one of our key learnings to start is collaboration, which this is a phenomenal photo that Nick here actually found around the power of physical human collaboration and what you can create. And this is one of the key things that I think is often missed when talking about technology and how tech companies are operating in quote unquote the future of work, which, side note, future of work is here. We're currently operating in it. It's not that far afield. And what that kind of looks like can be a lot of different things, but what you've seen, I think, also in headlines is that the future of work looks a lot like this, right? People are working remote. And so what that actually means is it's easier for people to be siloed. And so there has to be more focus on tech companies to actually learn how to collaborate effectively and actually put thought into that versus, oh, we're all in a room, we'll figure it out. And so that's actually been one of the drivers that causes tech companies to think about this, and more companies than just tech. Obviously, those are just the ones that I'm most familiar with. But some of the patterns that we see in collaboration, which I'll mention and then hopefully pause, and I'd love to hear a little bit about what you all see on the education side, is that companies are creating, and teams really are kind of the unit that we work with, are creating recurring moments for collaboration. Are y'all familiar with the idea of a stand-up or agile? Yeah, sweet. So stand-up, if you're not, is when you literally stand up each day and share what you're working on. And it's a moment for team collaboration that happens every day. At Range, we actually do that moment asynchronously. So we use our software to actually organize that, which can work for people who aren't always in the same space or even the same floor in a building. And what creating that recurring moment for collaboration means, you get roughly chaotic interactions. So if you think about, sometimes we think we know what we need to communicate with others, and it's like, here's all you need to know. And then you're at the proverbial water cooler or some other way in which you're communicating with folks, and something comes up and someone ear perks up and they're like, oh, what's that about? So part of it with people working in different ways is how you create those moments for collaboration if they don't happen naturally. Another item is setting clear responsibilities and roles in terms of how you interact. Are y'all familiar with the idea of RACI? It's something that basically says kind of like rules of engagement of how we should work together. So RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Okay, I think I got that right. So what that means is, on a project, if I'm doing the work, I'm responsible for it. So in a teaching relationship, it might also often be that students are responsible for taking the test. Teachers are often held accountable for how they perform. And so that's what the A is in that situation. So often when working with a teammate, or I'm trying to practice servant leadership and help the team achieve something, I'm still accountable for whether it gets done. Then there's the relationship of being consulted or informed. So consulted is, you may have super helpful information for someone else working on a project. And so in this case, it may be that teachers at another school are actually consulted on a different topic, or people in other industries to help inform what's actually being done. And then informed is kind of like FYI, which can feel harsh, but sometimes it is very nice to be only informed. I love it when my role on a project is informed, because I'm like, okay, that's not my responsibility. And then it's often very clarifying for people who aren't involved. And so when you think about kind of doing experimental work in education, understanding who is driving something versus who is just like receiving the results and then taking action on it at a later date. So I'll go into some of the other areas that we're excited about kind of within how collaboration happens, but I'd love to maybe pause, since we're kind of a small group, and hear about how folks are currently collaborating. I also don't want to go off on a future work tangent that doesn't feel as relevant. So I'm curious what you all are seeing in terms of how either teachers or principals and things are working together, or how different groups within education are collaborating. I'll pause. I'm comfortable with awkward silence, so I'll wait.
I'm from higher ed, and I just say we're the worst. We have to have a meeting. Like, it's all my meeting. Like, let's have a meeting. Oh my God, it's just awful. So I'm on a one-woman mission to like do something about that, but we have a meeting problem, and they're not that great at meetings either. So
that's what I was gonna ask.
It's really a problem. Yeah, it's evident.
And how would you say that? Is that detrimental to a collaborative environment, or is it that there's not a collaborative culture within those meetings, or is it both?
Oh, I think, yeah.
Interesting. Does it feel like teachers are given, or educators are given, time to actually collaborate on their work? That was, I guess, from my perception as a high school student who was not super aware of others, it did not seem like, okay, I'm seeing shaking heads. Yeah. So it would seem that I know I had a friend who started a company, Smarter Cookie, which was about filming educators to help them get feedback. I think it's unfortunately no longer in existence, but it seemed oriented towards helping folks work together, because it seems like there's so much learning from educators that are happening, but it's all disconnected in some way.
I think people do it. I think they collaborate
Yeah.
almost in spite of. And they usually have to add that to all the other meetings they go to where collaboration doesn't happen. So
Interesting.
that there needs to be sort of disruption to let go of this other, like we meet because we should, not because we don't need to give ourselves permission to say, but you know what, let's not meet, let's just use Slack or let's use something else. Like, let's not do that.
Huh.
So,
And
It's a business as usual culture.
it's higher ed, hasn't changed since. I don't know how long it's got some structural rigidity.
yeah, a good friend of mine works at or did some work with I think it's Southern New Hampshire University that I guess has the model of like I'm going to phrase it poorly, but like a more of a GED like model, but for higher ed, where it's like based on kind of certain metrics that you've met versus the program, which I thought was very interesting to hear kind of some of the innovation happening there at the edges. That's super helpful to understand that it's meeting based. I guess one kind of additional question, are the meetings mostly coordination oriented or like status update, or what's the content of the meetings that are happening?
I think it's
Lots of sighing.
Yeah. I think it's more just reporting out what's happening.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's my world. I don't know about you guys. My husband's an elementary school teacher. I was sharing, and it seems to be sort of the same way. You know,
it's similar in high school education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly with my school, it's a very heavy meeting culture.
Yeah.
However, I've worked at another school that had a very heavy meeting culture as well. But a bit more structure into the way that we met.
Yeah.
And it felt better.
Yeah.
There were defined actions.
Yeah.
There were defined goals. So each time we met, we left feeling like either we accomplished something or the time was well spent. Or we would even agree sometimes how much time we wanted to spend on topic or whatever it was. I can't say that for my current school. But it's just to say that the meeting isn't necessarily that in itself.
Yeah.
But really how you meet and what you do at that time. And making sure that all voices are heard too. I think that's an issue in our school too, is we have very loud voices, we have some voices who have great ideas.
Yeah.
I've heard because meeting space isn't inclusive to their type of communication.
Yeah. Like how you can incorporate written or other ways in which for people to share ideas, but that aren't just the loudest voice. That's helpful to hear that some do it well. What were we gonna share?
I was in a project that involves so I was in UCLA, and then I was the research assistant, and then there was other research assistant from UCLA, and then there was grad student from East Coast, and then there was one professor from MIT and then one professor from UCLA. So we were all working together, but so we had to agree on the coding scheme. So we had some like online meeting, just virtual meetings for like 3 or 4 times, and I thought it was pretty effective.
Yeah.
Like even though we're all like in different parts of the country, so that was my collaborative experience. I thought it was pretty successful.
That's awesome. So when we kind of dig into collaboration, we're a startup, so obviously we name our market so that it's exciting. So we talk about it as team success. I also think it is exciting. And so when we talk about team success, it is around how teams can be successful. So thinking about it as like a discipline. So like similar to how customer success, if you're familiar with that field, is around helping customers succeed, which also means companies do well, but it's that kind of the two sides to it. And so when we think about team success, we actually break it down from collaboration into a few other items. So one of those is transparency. Transparency can be a double-edged sword. So people talk about it in kind of lots of different ways of like, oh, you're an open book, you can share everything, and that can create other problems. But my sense is that it's really around sharing information and context. And so when we see how companies and teams are operating at kind of the edge of this, obviously they're using shared documents, like things like shared Google Docs, and they're writing a lot of their information down. So a good example is a company called Envision, which is a design company that helps designers share their work And they're actually entirely distributed, similar to the team that you mentioned, with kind of all being in different locations. And so they are rigorous about writing everything down. Like their entire onboarding document for a new hire is all written down. How you show up to any meeting is written down. The rules for setting an agenda is written down. And what that means is someone who has a question can go search and discover that information when they need to. So you don't have to be in the meeting to get the answer. And so a lot of what kind of Range's viewpoint on work and communication is that rote communication, that's a status update or an information about a process, should be written down. What you want to do in person is the sticky communication, like the really cool stuff that happens in classrooms where you're getting to learn and unblock students, but that like homework and other things that are written down are elsewhere. And so that's a lot of what we actually push our teams on. They also tend to default towards meeting heavy culture. You'll hear managers who are like, my job is meetings. I'm in meetings from 9 until 6 p.m. That's all that I do. If you want me to do other work, like hire someone else. And so we're trying to help them get out of that kind of process a little bit, and also around kind of empowering people through this information sharing. And one of that is also kind of having designated moments or cadence for sharing. And so through the lens of meetings or things like that, it's actually designating the different purpose of meetings. So for instance, are you all familiar with the idea of a sprint at all? So sprint is something in Agile, which is a way that software teams work, where you have kind of 2 weeks or sometimes longer periods that you work on a project. We'll go into that a little bit more later, but one of the things is at the end of that process, they do something called a retro meeting, where they like recap on the work that was either went well or didn't go well. And one of the things that's helpful there is having that designated moment for sharing feedback on how the process went. Means that the rest of the 2 weeks isn't slowed down by people being like, hey, this isn't going well. Hey, we need to share that. They're like, okay, I'm going to take a note for the retro to share it at that appropriate time, which frees people up cognitively. I don't know if you've ever been emotionally distracted by a piece of feedback that you really want to give, but knowing that when you have a moment to actually share that is actually really freeing, because then it's designated, it's kind of planned, and it frees people up to do their work day to day. The last aspect, which is a learning that I've had from coming out of the education system as a student and participant who was, I was very focused on grades, is sharing work in progress. So one of the big shifts, I think, since I was a child in education is around growth mindset. And what we've seen working with actually our team and our employees is that that's really hard, especially for people from underrepresented groups in technology, because it means that you may be judged based on something that is not perfect. And that the score may be not right. And for folks who have historically been graded or had a more difficult time, it is hard to show work that you're not confident in. But often with learning, what you need to do is show work in progress so that you can actually evolve, because there's more learning that's required when you share what you think, quote unquote, is perfect, and you have to take a step back. And so that's actually one of the biggest things I think that I've learned and is most difficult for our team to push on, and I see with other teams as well, is how you create a culture of sharing work in progress so that there's transparency about what's happening, but the shared expectation is not that it's final. And you're kind of separating out also work from the person, right? Like it's not a judgment of the person if they share something that's work in progress. It's a judgment of the work and how much time they had relative to other things. So I'd be curious, I know from some folks that I've talked to that often there's a culture more of Word docs and not shared documents in education space. I'm curious what you all have experienced about how much information is shared in terms of what's going on between these meetings, or if those meetings are really the moments where actually work gets shared.
I think each policy, a lot of the transparency depends on the principal. And
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I worked with principals who believe that you want to share as little information as possible because of the threat of litigation.
Yeah.
And then I've worked with principals who share everything, anything, and it's a train wreck.
Yeah.
Because there are no shared expectations of what to do with information. So I do think in schools, principals tend to set the tone for what transparency is.
Interesting. Does that, within like a school system, within a city or a county, is that similar across the schools in the system, or could it vary very differently within, even across those.
I think it varies
Yeah.
depending on the school.
I recently read a book, The Everyone Culture.
Oh, yeah.
Two Harvard psychologists, and they track kind of three main type or three companies and who have radical cultures, and they all do share certain aspects. One of them is transparency. The extreme version is a company called Bridgewater Associates, which is the most successful hedge fund firm, and they record and make available every single meeting. So if you wanted to see what the CEO just talked about with the COO, you've got access to it. And what was interesting is for the litigation, initially their lawyers were like, that's crazy. But actually it helped cut down on the litigation because they have everything recorded and people were very thoughtful and mindful about how they're communicating with the enforcing function. And they also have a very principle-driven culture. So there's a reference framework for exactly how they should be communicating their responsibilities. But yeah, I mean, just one, the amount of hard drives that's taking up to record every single meeting every day, but it really transformed how they think about communicating.
They also rate each other at the end of meetings, which I found more terrifying. One thing that's interesting here with transparency that I've seen at companies and on teams is that it often can be driven by role modeling. So one of the things, having worked for diversity and inclusion change in the tech industry, I understand that you often don't have allies, that you're the person in your school who's like, I want to work on this, or in your organization or whatever that may be. And so one of the things that I actually have seen with transparency is role modeling can be powerful, of when you run a good meeting or when you share notes afterwards, that people are like, huh, that was more useful. And they start to think about that and kind of ask you about it, much in the same way that this is a small group that will role model for others. So I think that is actually one that collaboration can be hard to do solo because you need other folks, but transparency can actually be something that you can drive a little bit within your school. The next area is around belonging, and this is often talked about in tech as kind of this fuzzy word culture, just like culture, and that's supposed to be self-explanatory and doesn't mean that you can have lots of different types of cultures. We think about it through the lens of belonging and psychological safety, and how you create an environment where I feel connected to you, but also where I feel safe, where I can fail, where I can make mistakes. Again, like leaning on that growth mindset lens that education taught us much about. And some of the things that we see teams do in this is creating kind of habits of community building moments. One I've listed here at the bottom, check-in rounds, is something where you kind of, everyone checks in at the beginning of a meeting and shares where their head is at. So you might, you actually see vulnerability change over time. So you might start with a new group of teachers or a new school that you're working with, and the check-in round is like, I'm good. Like, why are we doing this? I need a cup of coffee. And sometimes we'll put in like some questions. We have a list of team building questions at icebreaker.range.co where you can pull those up, and that helps prompt conversation. But where at teams where vulnerability has increased, I've actually seen people start to share things like, well, I just got in a fight with my wife, and so I'm feeling pretty grumpy right now. And like, they actually start to get into that, or like, I'm having some health issues, and you're like, whoa, like we're actually uncovering stuff at the beginning of this meeting that makes the rest feel at a much higher level of trust. My sense is that that is also something that you can do some role modeling on, but it really helps to have at least one other person who's there with you, because it's hard to be vulnerable if you don't already feel safe. So there can be a chicken and egg thing there that's difficult. This does obviously lead into the growth mindset, and kind of that feeling, your sense of safety trying something as an educator that may not work. And I know that's particularly weighty when there are students' outcomes like dependent on that. It's interesting because a lot of the future of work is talked about like, oh, tech companies can do that. They're just building software. But the groups that have actually led much of the charge are the military and healthcare, where you think of them having as the highest consequences, where there's been some research done. I think it's a hospital in Boston, but New England kind of blurs together for me, so it's somewhere up there, where the sense of psychological safety on the team with doctors and nurses really impacted patient outcomes. Because essentially, if a nurse feels comfortable speaking up and saying, I think that's the wrong order, that has a much higher relationship with patients surviving. Because if no one's contradicting, a doctor isn't invincible, nor is anyone, nor any nurse. And so having collaboration there on what actually gets decided to do depends on people feeling safe to do that. And so that's one of the really interesting things, I think, is that if healthcare benefits, then like probably all of us can do it, especially given their also legality and logistics issues that they have to deal with at an even higher level than education does. And this also, again, like as I mentioned before, retros are a good time to like share learnings and create that moment for giving one another feedback. I always thought about retros or this moment where you look back on a project as blameless, until when researching for this talk, I read this article that was like, let's be honest, we always blame. Let's just be aware of the blame and where we're placing it. And I was like, all right, that's a pretty reasonable like way to talk about this. And I think with education, as you're thinking about doing experiments into the future of work, creating environments where you feel safe, and pulling in those allies where possible. I've worked as a mentor for a couple different college and high school students who are kind of first generation, and a lot of that is first generation college students, pardon me, a lot of their interest depends on whether they feel safe at home pursuing college and that environment. And so that's been an interesting thing. As a mentor, and an educator, you only have so much impact on that. But I do think that how you all work together impacts then how the students feel and what, again, we can achieve. I'm curious, less focus on how students feel, but do you all feel currently in your roles that you have a sense of safety and belonging and kind of how you connect with other teachers? I've often seen the best teacher relationships, but I don't know how it works also with principals or kind of getting into more senior relationships there. Would be curious to kind of hear about that.
Yeah, so.
We worked with a manufacturing company a bit in, I think, Wisconsin. And the leader that we worked with was describing to me all the different ways in which they meet and engage, and they kind of the way in which they do stand-ups on the manufacturing floor. And I was like, all these things seem great. Like you have team charters for how you work together. Like you have these processes in place. And he was like, yeah, but they don't work. Like we're doing them, but they're not achieving what their purpose is. And I was like, oh, interesting. Like, okay, so it's less about putting it in place and sometimes about what people call like the amorphous culture underlying it. And that's actually where, I queued this one up well, we have purpose, which is the kind of like why behind things are being done. And I think education often gets off lightly on this one of like, of course we're here to help students. Like that's the why of what the work is. But there's also the why of like a specific project and being able to show that you have impact. Some of the research I did leading up to this conference was around understanding like what a driver that teacher experience in schools like vastly predicts whether they'll drop out of teaching or not, and then that being able to see impact year over year, that if you constantly feel like you're not being able to drive change, that is what leads to burnout, because you don't actually see progression. And so part of purpose is not just the why of are we all here, but also the impact that you are having and being able to see that. And that's where I think the kind of last topic that I have after this is around like iterative learning and experimentation. And that's what helps a lot of companies that are doing seemingly impossible things to feel like they are having impact. I can tell you as a startup founder, when I was telling Mark this earlier, when we first started doing sales, I kind of worked in sales and ops. No one wanted to buy our product. Everyone was like, cool, you've got some software. Cool idea. Maybe in a few years, like, let me know what you've got. And that's very disheartening, right? You're like, after the 50th call, I'm like, okay, coffee can only get me so far. Like, what am I going to do next? And one of the things that helps us to feel like we are having impact is working in short iterative cycles where we're trying to move a very clear needle on one item and having focus on what we are trying to accomplish during that time. And so that's one of the things I'm curious about as a people person myself. When I first started a software company, I was like, this is going to feel really not impactful because I'm not talking to someone. I'm not seeing the impact day to day, which I do some now. We get to hear how people share their emotions because they used range and things of that nature. But I'm curious from the education perspective, my sense is it's often seen as like a one-on-one of like, I impacted this student's life. But I'm curious how schools or higher ed or other groups are measuring impact overall and how that connects with the day-to-day of the work that you all are doing.
I think one of the challenges K-12 schools have now is the focus on standardized test scores.
Yeah.
And that becomes the purpose.
Gotcha.
And in schools where that has been taken to a degree,
yeah.
There's so little soul and humanity in teaching because it's all about teaching kids skills. And it's all about the numbers, how many kids moved from yellow to green, how many kids moved from red to yellow, and what teaching moves did you use to get them there.
Mm-hmm.
And the focus on discrete skills and measuring impact has taken away a lot of the complexity of teaching and instruction that happens. So schools that use student work samples as opposed to test scores tend to have much richer conversations, but that work isn't easily quantifiable and therefore not as appealing to people and decision makers who want to see higher test scores.
Interesting. And samples of student work means that they would review like an example essay or test or something that someone
or it could be a puppet show that was recorded, or it could be a drawing or diagram kids did.
Gotcha. That's really interesting.
In higher ed, I think there's been a shift to competency-based education, which is a variation of the test score. It's not quite the same, but the curriculum has to be very competency-oriented and very clear objectives, what you're going after in the classroom. The problem with that is that I think it has inhibited, competencies are a wonderful floor.
Yeah.
But there's so much, like, doesn't covering have aspiration? Would you rather have a competent surgeon or an excellent surgeon, right? I want something more often than someone who's just competent. So unfortunately, because of the pressures, people stick with the competencies, and thus education can get very late and I think having a very low ceiling.
And versus on the skill, teaching the skill to become excellent along with like being at the competent level.
Go beyond.
Yeah.
Just inviting and creating generative spaces where people can go beyond being competent to be creative.
It's interesting the tension between measurability of something and like aggregation of that information. Like it seems like a one-off puppet show recording is awesome. I can watch that. That's a really cool way to understand whether you're having impact. It's really hard to watch 500. That like makes sense. Like that's hard to like see across multiple things. And so I'm curious because, you know, companies face similar problems, right? Of like, okay, what's the work that's happening 16 teams down from senior leaders to understand like whether it's the right work. And there's often a disconnect between how a team is operating and the like quote unquote vision that's being set at the top. And so part of what our software and our bias is towards is how do you create that information loop back up? Because information always flows down. No one seems to have any trouble getting that information out. It's more the information coming back up that's really hard. So that's interesting to hear about kind of like impact essentially like going too far in some directions. The last one that I wanted to mention, and that I promise I'll wrap up, is around iterative learning. And that's something I mentioned earlier with this idea of sprint and working in short cycles, that my hunch is probably one of the hardest, but potentially a key within education is how you do like 2-week experiments to understand something and sharing that information out, again, on the transparency lens. Some of what we see companies do are obviously these sprints, but also iterative steering. So if midway through a sprint it's not working, they actually change what they're doing. There was a tweet actually recently about one of my co-founders and a story that he told to help drive home how you can drive things forward even when there's always tension between what could be done. So for instance, impact versus how you measure it, like that's always, it's a tension that we will likely continue to hold. And the story was around how like, okay, you have your team or your group of teachers and you're lost in the wilderness. Like, and you got to decide where to go. Like that actually puts very clearly how you have to make a decision. And so it might be eventually you get to like, okay, we're going to go to that ridge and then like get more information. but all sitting there talking about it changes nothing about where you are if you're lost. And while it's a strong analogy, and he and I are both into the outdoors, so we enjoy it, but I think one of the things that sprints forces companies to do is make decisions. So by having a 2-week check-in point, you have to make a decision about what you're going to do next every 2 weeks. And I think that actually forcing function changes a lot about how the work gets done and how you collaborate. And so there are also companies who do sprints on 6-month cycles. I wouldn't call it a sprint, but you can change that based on what is right for your team or your school. And it's interesting because you can think about doing those sprints with your students and helping them think through what that experimentation is like. I'm a math geek by training, so I like hypotheses. But one of the things to harken back also to writing things down is writing down what the purpose of what you're doing is and what you're testing. I've often found that I leave a meeting, as we were discussing, feeling super aligned, and then I write it down and everyone's like, that is not what I agreed to do. So one of the things with learning is also being clear on what you are learning about and narrowing that scope. So it can feel really easy to be like, well, we can test like 6 different things. And it's like, realistically, given that you're doing your other job most of the time, like, let's think about what actually can be tested in this period of time. And that, to go back to kind of purpose and impact, also I think is a fun way to incorporate that learning into your own work so that you are actually seeing that change. Even if it's something small, like, oh, I'm going to try this different teaching style for 2 weeks and see how folks react to it. Yeah, I'm curious, is sprint-like learning or iterative learning, does that feel like it's present in work right now and that you all are doing? Because obviously you get a new cohort sometimes every year or every period. And so I'm curious how that feels right now. I feel like my questions have been such downers, I'm sorry. So less so.
Well, but I think that's indicative of the separation between education and the rest of the world.
Okay.
The rest of the world is being flexible and moving and changing practices as either by force or just by virtue of growing and changing. And we're still in the 1900s. And it hasn't changed.
And that's driven by, it sounds like, some like legal concerns. But what else is I guess my culture mind goes to like what creates that sense of heft for folks when experimenting. Obviously, people care a lot about education and what happens with their children, so I understand that. But I'm curious what also comes up as you think about that.
I'm the wife of a teacher, so I mean, I think my husband feels very regulated. It's just all so.
Interesting.
He has some decisions he can make in the classroom, but the truth is, so much of it is regulated. What he's expected to get done in a given day, or he figured it out the other day that he's giving. I think there's something like 200. I'm making this up. 212. Instructional days a year or something, and he has to give 160 tests, evaluative kind of tests, which is, I mean, some days there's like 7 or 8 of them in one day, right? So they're
But
not,
still.
but it's still on average from a test, some kind of testing he's doing every other day as a 4th grade teacher. So you're just so regulated, and then if your test scores, if you don't teach to that, then you're punished, and it's intense. It can be sort of the floggings will continue until morale improves kind of environment sometimes. That way. Amazingly, and this is just a credit to teachers, they're bubbly and positive and they just jump around with hearts coming off of them all the time. But it's really challenging.
That's I think on the flip side, as a parent, I see the parents at my schools, like the parents don't let you iterate very much. Like you try to experiment something. If you go home and says this happened, the parents are like, where's the academics? What happened?
Yeah.
So it's not.
So very fear-based.
Higher ed, there's a lot of freedom in the classroom, but there's a big need. Like our big metric is that students aren't finishing, so completion rates in higher ed are big deal. The dropout rate very, very high, and state, especially state education institutions are under a lot of pressure around that. So that would be a wonderful place to be doing. Why don't we just try something? Let's just try giving out lunch one day a week. Let's just try that for a month, see if that happens. Or let's try, installing washers and dryers on campus. let's just do that. Free washers and dryers everywhere. Let's see if that happens. You know, just try some different things and see if it works.
Yeah.
We don't do that very often. I think just because I don't know, we just never get around to it or something, but we should, because that's a wonderful built-in. How can we just get people to stay?
Yeah. That's cool because it's like we don't know what's going to work. Like that's kind of the problem that we're in. And I apologize. I know we have a call in a sec. I wanted to leave you with a couple of things. One, I'm on Twitter. I'm terrible at Twitter. You should really just email me. I will do my best to follow up with you on Twitter, but I know it's my generation, but I'm not good at it. But also our blog, our resources page has a lot of articles. One of the things that was hard for me getting in the mindset for talking with you all was to be able to give like tactical ideas, because I'm not as involved in education. So a lot of it is more like, here's some inspiration for what you all can do. But I genuinely enjoy talking about these topics. And so if you're like, we're looking to try a project, or I'm working with someone who's looking to try something at a school, I'd be more than happy to talk and engage in that. It's just, I don't have enough context on like what education looks like day to day to be like, here's what you should do, because it would feel a little bit of a stretch there. And so, yeah, I'm happy to maybe answer a question or two. And then unfortunately, Nick and I have to head out for a quick call. But yeah, thank you all again for chatting and engaging as well.
Yeah.